After that night when Major delivered his historic speech in the barn, not many days passed before he passed away. Major died peacefully, but his words remained alive, echoing in the minds of the animals like an undying anthem. At first, nothing tangible happened. The days went on in their usual rhythm: hard work in the fields, meager food rations, and the shouts of Mr. Jones, who had become more negligent than before. But the seeds of rebellion that Major had planted began to grow. The most enthusiastic animals about the idea were the pigs. At their head, too, Napoleon and Snowball. Napoleon was a large, quiet pig, spoke little, but behind his silence was something of mysterious strength of will. Snowball, on the contrary, was full of activity and innovation, quick-witted, gave many speeches and coined slogans. These two together, along with a third pig named Squealer, began organizing the ideas that Major had left behind. They started holding secret meetings in the barn, speaking to the other animals about their rights and dignity. Little by little, the idea began to transform from just a song into a true revolutionary project. Mr. Jones in those days was not in his best state. His addiction to alcohol weighed on him more than ever before, and sometimes he would fall asleep in his chair in the kitchen, leaving the animals without food or water. Even his workers became careless. This negligence gave the animals an additional motive to become restless. Then the decisive moment came sooner than anyone expected. On a scorching day, Mr. Jones left the animals hungry longer than they could bear. They tried to break into the stores in search of food. As soon as Jones appeared with his men carrying sticks, the hidden anger exploded. The cows butted, the horses kicked, the sheep ran wild, even the dogs, ducks, and chickens joined in the chaos. Within a few minutes, Jones and his men retreated terrified toward the road, and the animals chased them all the way to the fence. Then they stopped there, panting, with among them spreading a strange feeling they had never known before. They had driven man out of the farm. For the first time, the farm was theirs alone.
From the second chapter onward, the features of the pivotal characters in Animal Farm begin to become clear, in a way that is almost a direct projection onto real historical revolutions and events. First, we find Napoleon, who appears large, quiet, and a few words, yet possesses an ability to impose his authority amid a mysterious silence. Napoleon here is very similar to the model we saw in figures like Stalin in the Soviet Union, a leader who in the beginning makes few statements, lets others showcase ideas, plans, and speeches, while he quietly busies himself building influence behind the scenes, so that when the decisive moment comes, everyone finds that he has become the true center of power. This pattern of the quiet, ambitious leadership is repeated often in history, where the man does not attract the masses with his eloquence, but rather intimidates them with his presence and corners them through secret alliances. In contrast, we find Snowball, who closely resembles the character of Leon Trotsky in the Russian Revolution. Intelligent, full of enthusiasm, loves crafting slogans and organizing committees, proposes projects to improve the farm or society quickly, and believes that the revolution should carry an idealistic character that achieves justice and knowledge. But such characters often suffer from weakness in building real power alliances, making them vulnerable to removal when the ideal collides with the domineering reality. Then there is Squealer, who clearly plays the role of the propaganda machine, quick to speak, clever in manipulating words, skilled at turning facts upside down to make white black and vice versa. Squealer is a direct model of any minister of information or official spokesperson for regimes that need to justify every decision, even if it contradicts the initial slogans. We have seen him countless times in history, from the Soviet newspapers that justified famines as victories over capitalism, to the official spokesmen of Middle Eastern regimes who justify repression and violations as protection of public security. As for the rest of the animals, the cows, the sheep, the horses, the chickens, and the ducks, they are the eternal example of the broad populations who suffer, work, and pay the price, yet only look for simple promises: more food, fewer working hours, a life without fear. These classes often move when pushed to the brink, as happened in the novel when Jones left them hungry. So they revolt without a clear vision, then quickly look for leadership to take them by the hand, often surrendering themselves without conditions to new leadership that may not differ much from the previous one. Thus we see that Orwell does not merely write about a farm and animals, but he draws with exquisite precision the features of characters we see in any revolution or radical change. The reserved leader who plans to seize power, the idealistic thinker who wants genuine change but lacks protection, the media supporter who lends legitimacy with words, and the masses who are driven by their needs and emotions more than by deep awareness. And these are characters that did not exist only in Russia, but we find them in the French Revolution, in third world countries, and even in modern political experiments wherever the same conditions gather.
When we read the second chapter of Animal Farm and see how Major died, leaving behind dreamy ideas about liberation, then how a group of pigs took over the leadership of the revolution and soon began interpreting the principles to their own advantage, we cannot help but recall the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century. Major here clearly stands as a symbol of Karl Marx, the thinker who laid the theoretical foundation for the workers' revolution against the bourgeoisie, but died before seeing these ideas turn into action. And as soon as Major was gone, just as Marx had died decades before the 1917 revolution, we found Napoleon, Snowball, and Squealer stepping forward to take the reins of the project, in an obvious allusion to Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, who formed the Bolshevik elite. The scene in which the animals abandon their miserable natural conditions to start talking about their rights, then train for revolution under the guidance of the pigs, reminds us of how the Russian working classes, peasants and laborers, lived in wretched conditions under the Tsar's rule until revolutionary organizations appeared that began making them aware of their rights and encouraged them to reject the existing situation. And with Jones's increasing negligence of his farm and his immersion in alcohol, the image of Tsar Nicholas II was completed, who was drowned in the palaces of St. Petersburg while famine swept through the countryside, at a time that made popular anger ready to ignite at the slightest chance. Then comes the chaotic moment when the animals stormed the stores driven by hunger, for events to explode quickly and end with the expulsion of Jones from the farm. This precisely parallels the early days of the Russian Revolution, when protests began due to shortages of bread and fuel, then turned into a general uprising that toppled the Tsar in a very short time. The ordinary revolutionaries in Russia then had no precise plan to run the country after toppling the old regime, just as the animals after expelling Jones had no deep conception of how they would run their farm now that it had fallen into their hands. All they knew was that they had gotten rid of the man they held responsible for their hunger. Even Squealer, who begins marketing ideas and justifying the leadership's behavior, is an early image of the official media that accompanied revolutions in many places, from the Soviet newspapers to the statements of radio broadcasts in many countries later on, where the media turns into the mouthpiece of the new authority, crafting justifications for it even in its earliest days. This pattern is not limited to Russia alone. The French Revolution itself began with the dream of justice and equality, after decades of peasants' misery and nobles' taxes. Then once the Bastille fell, matters spun out of control, and speakers and leaders rushed to fill the vacuum. And in the waves of liberation in the 20th century in Africa and Latin America, the same elements were repeated. Initial ideas about freedom and rights, new leadership investing in these ideas, angry masses unleashed by hunger and oppression, then a swift fall of the old regime, leaving the field open to complex power equations that might later veer far from the original principles. Thus, we discover that Orwell, in his Animal Story, simply wrote a tale that has recurred throughout human history. Lofty ideas born in the mind of a thinker, passed on to leaders more practical and perhaps more cunning, ignited by the anger of crushed masses, toppling the old system, only to later enter the test of power, which rarely succeeds in remaining faithful to its original principles. And what happened on the farm was merely an early prelude to what would come later, in the novel and in history alike.